to get us started, we'll start recording. Hope you enjoy.
Thanks, George. So yeah, nice to see everyone. Just some of the topics that I'll be looking to cover today, to talk essentially over what Microsoft Purview is, just at a high level, so we can get a bit of an understanding and discuss what we're looking at in this topic. Then we'll look to talk about the sensitive data that you may have in your organization. So that's normally the early challenge, really, is understanding what sensitive data you may have and what sensitive data you might not be able to automatically discover, but you might need to manually identify. Then we'll go in and look at how Microsoft Purview can help you identify that information. And then once you've identified it, then we'll talk about how you might classify it. And not only how you might do it, but why you should, and how that will help you in kind of your compliance journeys going forward. And then when we understand where it is and once it's classified, then how do we stop that from being shared externally? That doesn't always have to be maliciously. A number of the high profile cases recently have been due to accidents. So it's really just about showing users when they should and shouldn't be sharing, and then also stopping them from when they are. And then that's talking about going externally, but we also want to talk about how you can protect yourself against threats from inside the organization. So that's more centered around things like data exfiltration or threats from inside the organization, downloading to USBs, uploading to cloud portals. So we'll look at the Microsoft tooling that you can use to protect yourself against that. And once we've talked about all those technologies themselves, it's really about how they all fit together and how we build a complete solution using all those tools. So if we start with the first question of what is Microsoft Purview? So fundamentally, there's two parts. One is centered around data stored in Microsoft 365 and within your file shares. And there is another set of tooling that is used to concentrate on Azure workloads and data governance portal. So primarily today, we'll be looking at the technologies that are concentrated around Microsoft 365. So these technologies, if you've been in the portal, you might have seen that screenshot that I've got just there on the right-hand side. That could be found at on the portal at compliance.microsoft.com. And there's a whole raft of technologies within there. But today, really, we'll be looking at three key technologies in how you can protect your information. Those being information protection, data lifecycle management, and insider risk management. So we'll be looking at how those three technologies work, and then how they'll all fit together. And if you have permissions in your tenant, I'd highly recommend that you go and have a look in the portal, kind of get a bit familiar with it. There's lots of fantastic insights that will probably be already available within the Compliance Manager that will be ready for you to review. And so first question is, what sensitive data might you have? So what data do you want to protect? Now, this may range from things like personal identifiable information. So that's some examples I've got there on the screen, things like driving license numbers, passport numbers, physical addresses. And that's where you're looking to protect yourself against things like GDPR, or if people are making subjects access requests. And the other primary information that we also see people looking for is things like financial data, things like credit card numbers, banking details. And this may be more centered around things like PCI DSS compliance. And with so many transactions that are discussed digitally now, we find this is one of the areas that brings up quite a number of surprises. Things like credit card numbers being shared via Teams or emails. Obviously, we hope it doesn't happen, but yeah, it's very much good to get visibility on these things when they do. And outside of regulatory kind of requirements. You may just have confidential organizational information or intellectual property, things like that, that are specific to your organization. So we want to look at how you can protect these also. Obviously, this list isn't exhaustive, but just kind of some of the primary examples of what we encounter. And as I said, on the right-hand side, you've got some sensitive info types that Microsoft will already be looking for within your cloud store data in Microsoft 365. And as I mentioned, they're available there in the compliance portal. So you can go into there, have a look at what it may have found in your tenant already. So this is what we're looking for. So then we're going to want to find it and classify it. So I mentioned that Microsoft has a number of out-of-the-box classifications that it's using, and these are grouped into three main categories, which are trainable classifiers, sensitive info types, and exact data match. So if we start with the trainable classifiers, that's a Microsoft tool that you can train to on a repository of files to recognize certain types of documents. For instance, in this screenshot at the bottom, I'm looking for financial data. And once you've trained the tool, it will then go and look for those documents all across your organization, provide visibility on where they are. And one thing to note with trainable classifiers, you do normally need a minimum of 50 instances of that kind of document to initially seed the tool. But if you've got a lot, you can go with about up to 500 and get a really precise training on it. So these trainable classifiers are all available in your portal. So you can go there, have Microsoft start investigating and seeding that. But we do find sometimes that 50 instances of a document can be quite a number to pull together. So probably the most frequently used one is the next type, which is the sensitive info types. So sensitive info types are designed to search for strings or sequences of numbers or word lists, dictionaries within the information that you have stored. And because of the way it works, it's very good at finding things like addresses or credit card numbers, passport numbers, things like that. So that's another reason why I'd typically recommend that's where you'd start. And again, as they are built in, you may find that there's a number of these that have already been found across your organization. So again, if you've got access, I'd recommend having a look at the Content Explorer within your tenant, and you may find what it's found across your organization. Now, not only can you use the inbuilt ones, but you can also take copies of those and expand on them and improve them. So as an example, if you had a sensitive info type that is searching for a credit card number, say it's looking for a 14-digit string, but that's starting to pull up too many false positives, you can add what we call a supporting element to it, which is essentially a secondary check. So that secondary check would look for, say, a CVV number or an expiry date within a certain amount of characters to your initial search. So it provides a secondary check to make sure that you are finding exactly what you want and cutting out kind of those false positives. And the sensitive info type is strongest when you also use regular expressions, so regex. So regex allows you to look for a sequence of characters or a pattern, which you can build up over a host of different options. And if you're not comfortable with regex, or if you haven't really looked at it, I'd just put a link to regex 101 in that slide. I'd highly recommend having a look there because you can get an idea of the types of things you can look for. You can build, test, validate those regex expressions, and then you can carry those across and into your 365 tenant. So the last one I haven't included in this slide, but it's an exact data match. Kind of does what it says on the tin. So here you could feed specific examples. So unlike the trainable classifiers, it's kind of more in a individual use case. And you feed it specific examples, or you build a set of headers in a CSV format. And then it will go off and look for that specific use case across your organization. There is, within sensitive info types, a fingerprint sit, which kind of does something slightly similar, and it's slightly easier to use. So if that is something you're looking to do, yeah, I could explore that one first. All this protection, or this classification, sorry, that we've been talking about, mainly is focused around where your data is stored on the cloud, but all of this can be extended to your on-premise environments. So if you have install the Purview scanner agent on a on-premise server, you can then target your on-premise file shares, which will extend your kind of classification into all those shares. So that's a bit on how you discover the information, and that's all there for you there to see, as I said. But if you go have a look at the content list in your tenant, just to note that you won't be able to drill down unless you get one of two roles. So there's two admin roles within Purview that start with content list, just if you're going to go looking for those. So that's how we find information, but we haven't actually done anything with that, which is where information protection comes in. So we've gone and found information as per the sensitive info type or the exact data match that you've set up previously, but that doesn't apply any protections or any notification to the end users. So this is where we come to information protection. So with information protection, you can create a set of labels and a hierarchy, say from least confidential through to most confidential, and then publish these for your users to use themselves. And so in the screenshot I've got there, that's where within Outlook, so I'm able to tag my emails with certain labels depending on how confidential it is. And that user-led tagging helps build a good practice of where data, of how you consider that data as well. And not only can you do it in this user-driven mode, but with E5 licensing, then you can actually take those sensitive info types that we just discussed and have those actually automatically label. So with a auto labeling policy, we could publish, say, for instance, a label that is confidential financial. And if Microsoft finds a credit card number, then you can automatically label something based off that sensitive info type. And so it really just takes a lot of the administrative load away from either yourselves or the end users. And not only are we talking here about classification, but information protection can also place specific restrictions or controls on items that are labeled. So for instance, you may have a very confidential label and that you want to enforce some restrictions. And some of these restrictions may be file level encryption, or a restriction where users have to re-authenticate to access that file, say, every 7 days, which may sound slightly odd in isolation, but if you take the example of a confidential information document that is copied off to a drive by a departing user, and then they put that on the home machine, but because they've been marked as a user in your organization, their account is no longer valid. Therefore, when they try and access it, they're not able to, so they're not able to authenticate, so the document essentially is useless. And label-based encryption would provide, again, a kind of set of permissions, so that if the file was, say, stolen and taken elsewhere, and someone was attempting to access it, again, someone would have to try and authenticate to get into that file. If they didn't have valid credentials, they weren't part of that label encryption, then again, the file would be useless. So it provides kind of not only a way of classifying information inside your organization, but it also can provide that protection for when files actually leave the boundaries of your tenancy and your control. And the last thing I always like to add is on information protection, is that not only do these files provide kind of a technical benefit, but it helps drive really good end user behavior, and you can increase the visibility of that by adding things like headers, footers, or even watermarks. So on your most sensitive data, you can have that visual indication when someone's working with the file, so they can treat it with the care that they need to. So we've talked about how to find and how to classify that information. So hopefully by now we feel we've kind of got a strategy and a taxonomy of how we can find our information. So then it's time for us to start thinking about how the data acts within our tenant. And the first thing that we can look at for that is data lifecycle management. So data lifecycle management is essentially a retention policy, so retention and deletion. And with this technology, it's essentially two sides of a coin. So you can place items, a retention on items where they are deleted when they shouldn't be. So there is a copy retained. And that may be for things like if you have a need to keep financial records for 7 years, or you have safeguarding information that would need to be retained more indefinitely. So you can place that on retention, and then that would kind of be kept in, even in the use case of a user deleting it. The other side to that coin is that if you have information that you don't want to retain, for instance, things like personal information or personal data, or just to keep a cleaner environment, you can again set up a deletion policy so that items are kept for a certain amount of time and then automatically deleted. And there can be multiple triggers on how these policies work. So it could be from when files are created, but the one that we'd normally recommend is when a file is modified. So things like if you had a file that was created and had a 7-year deletion period, but the deletion period is based on it's modified and it gets edited at year 6, then it resets that clock. So yeah, it's very important when you're designing it and that you understand these principles of retention that I have just on the right there. And where these principles of retention come in is when we start talking about conflicts. So naturally, you're going to have policies that overlap. And when those policies overlap, we essentially have to work out which policy wins out. So one of the longest parts about implementing, I think, a solution like this is really mapping out how those policies will overlap around these principles of retention, so you understand if a conflict arises, what happens to those files. So we've talked about how to classify, how to label, how to keep and retain. So probably the most common used part of Microsoft Purview, and probably the most well-known, is data loss prevention. So data loss prevention builds on the classification and the information protection that we spoke about earlier, and really is designed to notify or warn users when they may be about to attempt to share data to sources that they shouldn't, or even just to block them to be able to do so. So the way data loss prevention works is you create rules based off what the data is and where it's being shared. So probably the most common example, if you've got information protection set up and it's got a confidential label, and as part of your kind of labeling policy or structure, it's deemed that confidential labels should not be sent outside the organization. I attempt to share it from my OneDrive or SharePoint to a user that's outside the organization. I'm going to get a notification when I'm attempting to share it that I can't. Now, it may be that you can configure it so that I can override that, because we understand that sometimes there may be needs that are outside of kind of normal day-to-day use. But to do that, I have to provide a business justification. So by doing that, it means we can have an audit trail. I'd still be able to carry on my day-to-day activities, but we do have a kind of a rationale as to why that was sent. And we understand that a lot of people do have to share certain information in day-to-day activities. So it is very much one that takes a bit of time to kind of consult within your organization. Another example that we quite often come around is things like credit card information. So if someone is attempting to share credit card information, again, via email, Teams, then this may flag the data loss prevention. And if we take the example of Outlook, it would create a policy tip with a customized message, possibly saying, are you sure you want to send this? And then they would be able to potentially override that, but again, providing the business justification. And all of these policies can be configured to send alerting as well to both administrators or kind of priority groups. But also if you're using things like Microsoft Sentinel, then it can also raise automated alerts to SOC. So you may have, I mentioned, you may have people that send this type of information as part of their day-to-day role. And obviously we don't want to get in the way of everyday activities. So you can get slightly more intelligent and actually set thresholds. So the example I've got on the screen there is I'm searching for national insurance numbers, passport numbers, or SWIFT codes. And it's when these items are being sent to people outside my organization. So I'd receive a policy tip, but for that, but just about halfway down, you'll notice that there's a specific threshold. So that's currently set to 10. And so the idea would be is if as part of my job role, we agreed that sending 9 instances of any of those information was normal. I'm not sure it would be, but that would be fine. But if I hit 10, then we're going to start to think, well, there's no reason really I should be sending that much information or that sensitive information all collated all together at once. So data loss prevention is going to pick up that it thinks something's amiss, send an alert, possibly give me a warning, etc. So again, it just really gives you a way of kind of providing a bit more control and not necessarily blocking everything at first sight. I say the most commonly used, and it's probably one that takes the quickest to set up, but kind of takes the longest to plan out, and really requires you to have done kind of quite a lot of work in terms of the sensitive info types that we spoke about earlier. So we've talked about protecting people's files in things like sharing from OneDrive and SharePoint. However, the other side of this Purview protection is more inward focused, which is insider risk management. So with insider risk management, it's there to protect users against potentially trying to exfiltrate data either intentionally or unintentionally. So this may be where you have someone who's had an unusual amount of information downloaded, and then they attempt to essentially copy that off to a USB, even things to if they suddenly print kind of quite a lot of sensitive information. But it can even get a bit smarter with connectors into HR systems, where you can then say, well, if someone's handed their notice in, then you can kind of target them with slightly lower thresholds. So it gets very clever as to what it can do in terms of how you can target people. And it's really there just to protect kind of all that sensitive information being kind of removed, rather than it's being shared over the internet. It's really the internal focus. So the things it can kind of detect, and especially if you've got Microsoft Defender, some of the indicators that you can get is a massive list. But things like printing, if you've got information protection labels, it's where people are downgrading a number of labels all at once. But I think the best use of it is when it not only detects a single activity, but it starts detecting sequences of events. So if I give an example of a user that downloaded 10 files over a period of kind of 2 hours, and that's fine. That would kind of deem to be normal use. So you wouldn't necessarily want to flag that. However, if you've got an insider risk management policy configured with a sequence, you may say that if they've downloaded those 10 files, then downgraded the information protection label that you've applied to them, and then copied it to a USB or attempted to upload it to a cloud storage location, and that would kind of be a little bit more suspicious. So at that point, we'd be looking at, well, okay, we want to flag an alert for that. And you can have multiple thresholds for this. Again, much like I talked about previously. And certainly, again, if you're using something like Microsoft Sentinel, that can also feed directly into Sentinel, and you can have SOC generated alerts straight from it. So if I look at the example that I've given there, so that's a theft by departing users. So in this example, I'd have a connector set up with my HR system, so that we get a periodic kind of output from the HR system to let us know if someone started working their notice. If they are, then we have the users moved into a slightly higher priority group, at which point they come under the this policy, which would start then monitoring unnatural or out of band accessing the files, downloading, and in this instance, so I'm predominantly looking at SharePoint. So if they're sharing outside the organization, now that may be covered by the DLP policy that we spoke about earlier. But it also may be if they started syncing a number of bits from SharePoint down to their machine. So not necessarily sharing them out, but pulling them down, and then sequences where I'm then trying to downgrade labels or upload those to cloud portals. So that's the kind of technologies all themselves, and how they kind of work on an individual basis. So I suppose, how do we put those all together? So how do we use them to utilize a full solution? So as I mentioned earlier, we started with the sensitive info types, the exact data matches, and the trainable classifiers. That data classification really forms the basis for kind of everything else. So it may seem frustrating to spend quite a bit of time on those, but they really do impact kind of your compliance journey further on, because they also feed into things like automated labeling and that automated E5 kind of level, where you don't have to rely on people necessarily tagging the data correctly, and you can do it at a much bigger volume all at once. So you spend a bit of time working out what your data is, where it is, how you want to classify it, And then once you've kind of got an idea through that, then you start thinking about, okay, well, what do I want to do with that? And that's where the second layer would come in. And so that's the information protection labeling and the data lifecycle management. So again, with the data lifecycle management, what do we need to keep? How long do we need to keep it for? And what don't we need to keep? How quickly do we want it to be removed? And again, if you spend enough time working on that as an automated process, then it removes a lot of the administrative kind of housekeeping that you may come up against in a day-to-day. And for information protection labels, we look at the classification that you want in your organization. So what labels do you want to publish out to users? The trick I always say with information protection labels is keep it simple, because you don't want too many. Because if you have too many, people will just start picking one at random. So define your label taxonomy, and then if there's going to be any requirements at the more sensitive end in terms of encryption or time-limited access where people have to authenticate. So once you've got those two in place, then it's the kind of outside ring as such protection. So it's the data loss prevention policies. So that's where we're looking at protecting information being sent from your tenant outside. And that also has the potential to kind of be quite impactful, because it may require users to change how they were doing some information or transfer. And then you have the insider risk management. So insider risk management, again, is just what we've just spoke about in terms of inward facing. So that's where users are intentionally or non-intentionally taking large volumes of data and trying to exfiltrate it from your protections. But yeah, that's essentially how we use each of those technologies layered up on top of each other. And that's what we've worked with a number of our organizations we work with, to build that compliance journey for them. And it's only, yeah, it's a journey. It's not a build it once and turn it on. So that's me giving you a very high level and a quick whip through Microsoft Purview. So does anyone have any specific questions that they wanted to raise here with me now? And we've got a bit of time, I can answer some questions.
Don't be shy with questions, everybody, if there's anything that you would like to ask. For those that haven't seen it, there's been a few questions that my colleague Adam has shared in the polls. Thanks for those responses on that.
Perfect. So yeah, one question in chat, I think, around.
Yeah, there we go. It's normally the way.
Yeah. So first question is elements E3, E5 licensing and costs. So with the main difference between E3 and E5 generally is the automation. So the features are available to you with E3, but it's really the automation around it. So things like data loss prevention is available, information protection is available, but you wouldn't have any access to adaptive scopes or automated kind of doing say for instance, a label based on financial, based off a credit card number.
Yeah, best way to think about it is your users will have to be actively involved in that process to, for example, label content. That's right, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
The second question, Purview covering non-Windows platforms. So predominantly depends what you mean by covering. So if we look at the individual technologies, so So data lifecycle, information protection, generally those are kind of all cloud. So they are looking at where data is stored in the cloud. So the protections are placed at cloud level, not at a device level. And then for insider risk, it depends whether or not you're using Defender. So Defender really would kind of be the linchpin there. So it gives you a bit more device control. But yeah, a lot of the Purview items are really looking at where your data is stored, not where the device on the device specific.
Just to cover the cost element in Simon's question, you would be able to add the E5 compliance add-on. So depending if you're on CSP or EA, the published amount via CSP is £9.50 per month on an annual commit per license. You would need E3 as a minimum to then add bolt-on on. That price will obviously differ depending on if you're on an enterprise agreement or not as well.
Cool. And then can you build automation to route through label changes through data owner to go before they go externally? So you can have labels. So I suppose this is a twofold. Do you mean can I have a approval process for the label to change, or can I have if I send something that's labeled externally, can I have an approval process for it to get sent? Kind of depends on that. But label changes, you can have with things like data lifecycle management, you can have disposition reviews. So where that can go through a number of people's hands essentially to confirm. Label changes generally, you don't necessarily have an approval process. It's more business justification if it's gone down a sensitivity label in priority. And then if data is going externally, for DLP, you could essentially have the override. I think US may be able to send it to, rather than just blocking, it may have to go to an approval. I will just double check that in my tenant note because that's not something I've tried.
Okay, I think there was also a hand up from Greg. I don't know if your question was asked separately.
Yes, yeah, it was. It was around the licensing, and was it the automation predominantly the difference between the E3 and E5? So thank you.
Perfect. All righty. Any other questions from anyone else before we close off?
I suppose what might be worth mentioning, Ian, is we've done this with multiple clients, and as Ian's also alluded to, this is more of an ongoing piece of work than a build and done. The kind of first thing that we would always recommend is going through a POC with a select department. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that at all, Ian.
Yeah, so yeah, as I said at the end, it's definitely not a configure and turn on. The way we normally approach it is a stage kind of rollout, and then we have what we call improvement loops. So you'd have a rollout to a team with kind of the initial steps. So for instance, maybe just labeling, but no restrictions on that. A DLP policy in audit mode, so you can get a notification, but it doesn't block people from sending. Let that bed in, let the user educational piece happen, and then feedback with another loop to then increase that protection. And you kind of just have this rolling system then, which helps with user adoption and doesn't disrupt everyone's day-to-day.
Any further questions on adoption on this topic before we wrap up? If anyone does have any further questions and hasn't responded to the last poll about if you want to be in touch, then you're more than happy to reach out to either myself, Ian, or George. that'd be great. But I guess that kind of sums it up and rounds it off. Okay.
Perfect to know. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for
Some
joining.
interest.
Yeah, thanks for that. Cheers.
Thank you, guys.